Imagine a grand ballroom filled with millionaires. A powerful, rich man lifting his spoon for the first bite. Suddenly, a homeless child bursts in screaming, "Stop! Don't eat that food!" People laugh. Security rushes in. Everyone thinks it's nonsense until they discover the food was poisoned. The real shock? This child knew because he'd seen it before. And his warning would expose a deadly secret that changed every life in that room forever. "Stop! Put the spoon down! Don't eat that food!" The words didn't just echo through the room, they shattered it. For a split second, time itself seemed to freeze. Crystal chandeliers hung like glowing constellations from the high ceiling, their warm golden light reflecting off polished marble floors and rows of perfectly arranged tables. The room was filled with the quiet confidence of wealth, tailored tuxedos, glittering diamond necklaces, champagne glasses held casually by hands that had never known hunger. Just moments earlier, soft classical music had drifted through the ballroom, blending with polite laughter and low conversations about stock markets, private jets, and overseas properties. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved gracefully between tables, silver trays balanced effortlessly in their hands. The air smelled of expensive perfume, fresh bread, and a rich, carefully crafted soup prepared by one of the city's most exclusive chefs. Everything was flawless, until the shout. At the center of the grand ballroom sat Richard Holloway. A name that carried weight. A man whose presence alone commanded silence in boardrooms and obedience in courtrooms. Richard was one of the richest businessmen in the city, self-made, sharp-minded, and known for his absolute control. He wasn't loud, he didn't need to be. Power followed him naturally, like a shadow. Tonight, he sat at the head table. Posture, straight, expression calm, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. The kind of man who never rushed, never hesitated, and never doubted his decisions. In front of him rested a white porcelain bowl filled with soup, simple in appearance, but prepared with rare ingredients flown in from across the world. Richard lifted his silver spoon. The spoon hovered just inches from his lips, and then, "Don't eat that!" The shout exploded from the far end of the ballroom. Every head turned at once. The music stopped mid-note. Chairs scraped loudly against the floor as guests stood up in shock. Conversations died instantly, replaced by gasps and confused murmurs. Some people thought it was a joke. Others thought it was a protest. But then they saw who was shouting. A child. A small, thin figure had burst through the massive double doors at the back of the room. The doors slammed against the walls, their loud bang echoing through the stunned silence. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 years old. He was barefoot, his clothes were torn, stained with dirt, and clearly far too big for his fragile body. His jacket hung loosely off his shoulders, one sleeve ripped at the elbow. His pants were faded and frayed at the edges, barely held up by a knotted piece of string. His hair was messy and uncut, falling wildly around his face. His skin was smudged with grime, and his cheeks were hollow, the unmistakable face of hunger. But it was his eyes that stopped people cold. They weren't the eyes of a mischievous child. They were wide with terror. The boy ran across the polished marble floor, his bare feet slapping loudly with each step. He nearly slipped once but caught himself, never slowing down. His chest heaved as he ran, breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps, straight toward Richard Holloway. "Don't eat that!" the boy screamed again, his voice cracking. "Please!" Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. Several women instinctively covered their mouths. A few men cursed under their breath. Someone dropped a wine glass. It shattered loudly, the sound slicing through the tension. Security guards immediately sprang into action. Where did he come from? How did he get past the entrance? "This is a private event!" Two guards rushed forward from opposite sides of the room, hands already reaching for the boy. Guests backed away from the center aisle, faces filled with disgust, fear, and disbelief. "This is outrageous. Remove him immediately. Call the police!" But Richard Holloway hadn't moved. The spoon was still in his hand, suspended in midair. His heart was pounding harder than he cared to admit. He stared at the child running toward him, this boy who looked like he hadn't eaten properly in days, maybe weeks. A boy who clearly didn't belong in a room like this, and yet something was wrong. The boy wasn't smiling, he wasn't begging, he wasn't looking at the crowd. His eyes were locked on Richard, as if nothing else in the world mattered. The guards reached him just a few feet away from the table. "Sir, stop!" One of them shouted. The boy skidded to a halt, breathing hard, his small chest rising and falling rapidly. He raised a trembling hand and pointed directly at Richard's bowl. "Don't eat it!" he cried again, his voice raw now. "Please don't!" Richard finally moved, slowly, deliberately. He lowered the spoon back toward the bowl, but didn't. Release it. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Richard stood up. At over 6 feet tall, dressed in an immaculate tuxedo, he towered over the boy. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, searching. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to grab the child or wait for their employer's command. Richard raised one hand slightly. "Wait," he said. The guards froze. A ripple of surprise passed through the guests. Richard took one step forward, then another. He was now only a few feet away from the boy. "What is your name?" Richard asked, his voice steady but firm. The boy swallowed. Hard. His hands were shaking now. My name is Eli," he said quietly. Richard studied him closely. The dirt under his nails, the torn shoes that weren't even there, the fear etched into his young face. "Eli," Richard repeated. "You just interrupted a very important event." The boy nodded, eyes never leaving the bowl of soup. "I know," he whispered. Richard tilted his head slightly. "Then tell me something, Eli." The entire room leaned in without realizing it. "Why?" Richard said slowly. "Shouldn't I eat my food?" The boy's breathing quickened. For a moment it looked like he might run or collapse. Inside his mind, memories flashed. Another banquet, another bright room, another bowl of food. The smell, the sweetness that didn't belong. Because I've seen this before, he thought. Because last time, no one listened. Eli clenched his fists, gathering every ounce of courage he had left. He looked up at Richard, his eyes glossy with unshed tears, and in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said the words that would change everything, "Because that food is meant to kill you." The silence that followed was absolute. No music, no whispers, no movement, just the sound of a single spoon trembling slightly in Richard Holloway's hand. The moment the boy finished speaking, the spell of silence shattered. 2 security guards lunged forward and grabbed him by the arms. "Take him out!" a voice shouted from the crowd. Another followed, louder. "This is unacceptable!" Eli flinched as strong hands clamped around his thin wrists. His body was light, too light for a child his age, and the guards barely had to try as they began dragging him backward. "Wait." The word was calm, but it carried authority. Richard Holloway's voice cut through the noise like steel. The guards froze mid-step, their eyes darting toward him. No one disobeyed Richard Holloway, not in boardrooms, not in courts, and certainly not in his own banquet hall. Slowly, deliberately, Richard turned back to the table and set the silver spoon down beside the bowl. The faint clink of metal against porcelain echoed unnaturally loud in the tense room. That small sound told everyone something important. He was listening. The guards loosened their grip, though they didn't let go. Eli stood there, chest heaving, his knees slightly bent as if ready to collapse. Up close, he looked even smaller. His skin was pale beneath the dirt, his lips dry and cracked. The boy was clearly starving, exhausted, and terrified, yet Richard noticed something else. There was no madness in his eyes, no wild desperation. There was knowledge, hard-earned, painful, the kind no child should ever have. Richard stepped closer again, ignoring the murmurs behind him. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone measured now, less sharp than before. The boy swallowed. His throat felt tight, like it might close up completely. "My name is Eli," he said quietly. His voice trembled, but he forced the words out anyway. "Eli," Richard repeated. He glanced around the room briefly, at the stunned guests, the uneasy guards, the pale-faced staff. "You've just caused quite a scene." "And?" he asked. "I saw them bring your soup." The room stilled again. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "Who is them?" Eli didn't answer immediately. He scanned the room, his eyes darting across unfamiliar faces. Rich men, powerful, women, people who looked untouchable. Then his gaze fixed on one spot. "The man with the scar," Eli said quietly. "On his cheek." A ripple of movement spread through the crowd. Several heads turned instinctively. A man near the far wall stiffened. The chef, standing a few steps behind Richard, suddenly went pale. Beads of sweat formed along his hairline. "He was arguing with the chef," Eli continued. "He said the soup had to be served exactly as it was." The chef swallowed hard. "That's not," he began, then stopped. Richard noticed. "Is that true?" Richard asked, without turning around. The chef hesitated just a second too long. We had a disagreement," he admitted. "About seasoning." Eli shook his head quickly. "It wasn't about seasoning." He raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the bowl on the table. "That soup isn't right," he said. "It smells sweet." Several guests leaned forward. "So?" someone muttered. "Lots of soups smell sweet." Eli shook his head again, more urgently this time. "It shouldn't," he insisted. "Not that kind." Richard leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping. "How would you know that?" Eli's throat tightened. "I've smelled it before," he said. The room grew tense. "Before? Where?" Richard asked. Eli's eyes glistened. He looked very young in that moment, younger than anyone had noticed before. "At another banquet," he said, his voice cracking. "Another place like this, big tables, fancy lights." His hands began to shake. "There was another rich man," Eli continued. "He was laughing, just like you were." A heavy silence settled over the room. Eli swallowed hard. He ate the food, he whispered. And before dessert, he fell to the floor. A woman gasped softly. Another guest stepped back as if distance could protect them. "He didn't get up again," Eli finished. No one laughed now. The boy lowered his head, shoulders trembling. Not with fear anymore, but with memory. "I tried to warn him too," he whispered, "but no one listened." Richard straightened slowly. For the first time since the boy had entered, something unfamiliar flickered across his face. Not anger, not doubt, but concern. And the room felt it. The moment Eli finished speaking, the ballroom erupted. Murmurs exploded. Across the room like sparks from a fire. "That's absurd. He's making it up. This has gone far enough. Get that child out of here." Voices overlapped, growing louder with every second. Chairs scraped back as people stood. Up, some angry, others visibly shaken. A few guests laughed nervously, trying to convince themselves that this was all a ridiculous interruption, nothing more than a homeless boy's wild imagination. Security guards tightened their grip on Eli again, ready to drag him away, but before they could move. Richard Holloway raised his hand. The gesture was small, but the effect was immediate. Silence rolled across the ballroom in waves. Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Bring the chef here," he said calmly. The guards paused. The chef, who had been standing stiffly near the service area, hesitated. His face had drained of color, and sweat glistened along his temples. Slowly, reluctantly, he stepped forward. Each footstep sounded heavy. Final. Richard turned back to the table and gestured toward the untouched bowl of soup. "Drink it," he said. The chef blinked. "Sir? You heard me?" A hush fell over the room. Guests leaned forward in their seats. No one dared to speak. The chef swallowed hard. "I can't," he stammered. I'm on duty." "I shouldn't." Richard's hand came down hard on the table. The sharp crack of wood echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Several people flinched. "Test it," Richard commanded, his voice cold now, stripped of patience. The chef's knees seemed to weaken. He looked around, searching for support, for someone, anyone, to intervene. No one did. A waiter stepped forward quickly, lifted the bowl with trembling hands, and handed it to a security officer. "Take this to medical," Richard ordered. "Now." The security officer nodded and hurried toward the exit. Another guard followed, carrying a sealed container for testing. The doors closed behind them, and suddenly, there was nothing to do but wait. Whispers filled the air again, but this time they were different, quieter, tighter, filled with unease. What if the kid's right? This is insane. But what if it's not? No one would dare poison him. Would they? Eli stood alone in the center of the ballroom. The guards had released him, but no one moved closer. Guests avoided his eyes as if his presence itself made them uncomfortable. He looked small and exposed beneath the glittering chandeliers, his bare feet cold against the marble floor. Ignored. Judged. Just like always. Richard watched him from a few steps away. Up close, the boy's fear was impossible to miss, but so was his control. Eli wasn't crying. He wasn't begging. He was waiting. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. He approached Eli slowly and knelt down in front of him, lowering himself to the boy's level. A murmur of surprise passed through the crowd. No one had ever seen Richard Holloway kneel to anyone. "How do you know about poison?" Richard asked quietly. His voice was no longer sharp. It was careful. Eli hesitated. His eyes flicked around the room, at the expensive dresses, the polished shoes, the faces that had laughed at him only moments earlier. Then he looked back at Richard. "Because my mother died from it," he said. The words landed softly, but they hit harder than any shout ever could. Richard's breath caught in his throat. The room fell silent again. Eli took a slow, shaky breath and continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was a cleaner," he said. "Just like me. She worked wherever they'd let her. Offices, hotels, private events." His hands trembled as he spoke, but he didn't stop. "She heard things she wasn't supposed to hear," Eli continued. "People arguing, planning." Richard's jaw tightened. "One night," Eli said, "she warned someone, a man who was about to eat." A painful pause followed. She told him not to trust the food. Eli's eyes filled with tears now, but he blinked them away fiercely. "He didn't listen," he said. "But someone else did." The meaning of his words sank in slowly. "They poisoned her food," Eli whispered. 2 days later, a woman in the crowd covered her mouth, tears spilling over. Someone else turned away completely. Richard felt a cold wave wash over him. "And after that?" he asked softly. Eli shrugged, a small, broken gesture. "After that, I was alone. Silence wrapped around the room like a heavy blanket. No one spoke. No one dared to. Then suddenly, the doors burst open. A man in a white coat rushed into the ballroom, breathless, followed closely by the security officers. It was one of the hotel's doctors. His face was pale. Very pale. Richard stood up immediately. "Well?" he demanded. The doctor swallowed hard before speaking. "Mr. Holloway," he said quietly, "the soup contains a slow-acting toxin." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd. "Lethal within an hour," the doctor added. For a split second, the room didn't react. Then, chaos. Screams erupted. Chairs toppled as people scrambled backward. A woman fainted. Another guest shouted for water. Several people began shouting accusations, pointing fingers wildly. The chef collapsed into a nearby chair, his face buried in his hands. Richard didn't move. He stared at the bowl of soup, at the silver spoon, at the meal that would have ended, his life before dessert. Then he turned his gaze back to Eli. The boy stood there, small and silent amid the chaos. Richard understood something in that moment, something that chilled him to the bone. Eli hadn't saved him by chance. He hadn't guessed. He had recognized the signs, because he'd seen death before, because he'd lived through it. Because pain had taught him what no child should ever have to learn. Richard straightened, his expression hardening, not with anger, but with resolve. This wasn't over, not even close. The sound of sirens cut through the night only minutes later. Police. Cars lined the entrance of the hotel, red and blue lights flashing through the tall glass windows of the ballroom. Officers moved swiftly and decisively, their radios crackling as they secured the area. What had begun as an evening of luxury had turned into a crime scene. The guests were instructed to remain where they were. Some protested angrily. Others sat, frozen, pale and shaken, finally realizing how close death had come to walking among them unnoticed. The man with the scar didn't get far. An officer caught him near a side exit, just as he was trying to slip into the service corridor. His confidence crumbled the moment the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. Under interrogation, the truth spilled out quickly. He wasn't acting alone. He was a fixer, hired by a powerful business rival who had everything to gain from Richard Holloway's sudden death. The plan was simple, cruel, and efficient. Poison the food, make it look like a natural medical emergency, and let the world move on. The chef was cleared of all wrongdoing. Tears streamed down his face as officers removed him from suspicion. He admitted he had been threatened, his family's safety used as leverage to force his silence. He had followed instructions out of fear, never knowing exactly what had been added to the soup. Fear had nearly killed a man, and ignorance would have let it happen. As the ballroom buzzed with voices, questions, and accusations, one person sat, unnoticed again. Eli. He sat cross-legged on the cold marble floor near the edge of the room, his back against a decorative pillar. The chaos swirled around him, officers moving, guests arguing, staff whispering. But no one looked his way, just like always. The adrenaline that had carried him this far drained from his body all at once. His hands trembled. His stomach cramped painfully, reminding him how long it had been since he'd eaten. He hugged his knees to his chest and stared at the floor, suddenly very tired. That's when polished shoes stopped in front of him. Eli slowly looked up. Richard Holloway stood there, the richest man in the room, the man whose life he had just saved. Richard didn't say anything at first. He looked down at the boy, at his thin arms, his bare feet, the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. For the first time in his life, Richard noticed how invisible a child like this could be, even in a room full of people. Slowly, deliberately, Richard bent down. Then, something no one expected. He knelt. At eye level. The room went quiet again. Not because Richard had demanded it, but because people were watching something rare. Power lowering itself willingly. "Why did you do it?" Richard asked gently. Eli blinked, unsure. "Why did you risk your life to warn me?" Richard continued. "You knew they could hurt you." Eli shrugged weakly, his shoulders barely rising. "Because no one warned my mom," he said simply. "The Words hit harder than any accusation ever could. Richard swallowed hard. For the first time in decades, shame burned in his chest. Shame for every time he had ignored the unseen, for every warning dismissed because it came from the wrong mouth, for every person he had stepped over on his way to the top. He stood up slowly and turned to face the guests. Men and women who had mocked the boy minutes earlier now avoided his gaze. "This child," Richard said loudly, his voice steady but heavy with meaning, "has more courage than anyone in this room." No one spoke. No one argued. Richard turned back to Eli and extended his hand. "Come with me," he said. Eli flinched instinctively. Years on the street had taught him that invitations often came with consequences. Am I in trouble?" Eli asked quietly. Richard shook his head. "No," he said softly. "You're going to be safe." That night, Eli ate a real meal for the first time in weeks. Not leftovers scraped from a plate. Not cold food pulled from a trash bag. A warm meal. He sat at a small table in a quiet room, staring at the food as if it might disappear. He ate slowly, at first, carefully, as though afraid someone would take it away. Richard sat nearby, not rushing him, not watching too closely. Just present. After dinner came a hot shower. Clean clothes, a bed. Eli fell asleep almost instantly, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. Days turned into weeks, and for the first time since his mother's death, Eli woke up knowing where he would sleep that night. Richard kept his word. He arranged medical care to address Eli's malnutrition and untreated injuries. Doctors spoke gently, explaining things no one had ever explained to him before. Therapists helped him talk through the memories he had buried just to survive. Richard enrolled him in school. At first, Eli struggled. He was behind. He didn't trust easily. He flinched at raised voices and loud noises, but he was smart, curious, hungry, not just for food, but for knowledge. And Richard didn't stop with Eli. What happened that night changed him. He reviewed his companies, uncovering corruption he had once ignored because it was convenient. He cut ties with partners who thrived on fear and silence. He opened shelters, not temporary ones, but safe places designed to help people rebuild. He funded kitchen job programs for homeless youth, ensuring they were paid fairly and protected. He demanded accountability because he had seen what ignoring the powerless could cost. And Eli grew stronger, smarter, braver. He learned to read faster than anyone expected. He asked questions constantly. He volunteered at the very shelters that had once saved him. He never forgot where he came from, and Richard never forgot who saved his life. The powerful had fallen that night, not in death but in arrogance. And the powerless had risen, not through force, but through truth. 10 years later, the city had changed. So had the world. But on this night, a grand hall once again filled with people, only this time the energy in the room felt different. There were no whispered conversations about stock prices or hostile takeovers, no quiet competitions over wealth or status. This gathering wasn't about power. It was about hope. The hall was large and elegant, but simpler than the ballroom of the past. Soft lights illuminated banners that read, "Community, Second Chances," and "Listen." Rows of seats were filled with teachers, social workers, former foster kids, business leaders, volunteers, and families, people from every walk of life, sitting side by side. At the center of the stage stood a familiar figure. Richard Holloway, older now, his hair touched with gray, the sharp edges of his face softened by time and reflection. The man who once ruled boardrooms with silence now stood before the crowd with humility. He stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and waited. The room fell quiet. 10 years ago, Richard began, his voice steady but reflective, I attended a dinner meant to celebrate success. A few people in the audience nodded, recognizing the reference. I believed I was untouchable, he continued. I believed money made me safe. He paused. I was wrong. A murmur rippled through the hall. Richard gestured towards someone, standing just behind him. Tonight, he said, a faint smile forming, I want you to meet the reason I'm still alive. A young man stepped forward. He was tall, confident, and neatly dressed in a clean, well-fitted suit. His posture was straight, not stiff, but assured. His eyes were calm, thoughtful, and observant. This, Richard said proudly, is Eli. The audience erupted into applause. Some clapped politely. Others stood immediately, sensing the weight of the moment. Eli nodded slightly, his expression composed but grateful. 10 years ago, Richard continued, this young man ran barefoot into a room full of powerful people and shouted words that no one wanted to hear. He let the memory hang in the air. He saved my life, Richard said. But what no one knew back then, Richard paused. The silence deepened. Is that he didn't just save me. The audience leaned in. He saved this city. The weight of the words settled slowly, then all at once. Richard stepped aside. Eli moved toward the podium. For a brief moment, the hall was so quiet that the faint hum of the lights could be heard. Eli took a breath. I was homeless, he began. His voice was calm, clear, and steady. I slept wherever I could. I cleaned dishes for food. Most days, people didn't even look at me. Faces in the crowd softened. I learned early that when you're invisible, you notice everything, Eli continued. You hear conversations people think don't matter. You see dangers others overlook. He paused, glancing briefly at Richard. Knowledge kept me alive, he said, but compassion changed my future. A hush fell over the hall. Eli continued. That night, 10 years ago, I didn't think I was being brave. I was just doing what I wish someone had done for my mother. A wave of emotion rippled through the audience. All it took, Eli said quietly, was one person willing to listen. The silence broke into thunderous applause. People stood. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others embraced the person sitting beside them. The applause didn't fade quickly. It grew louder, stronger, filled with gratitude and something else. Recognition. Every voice matters, Richard said, especially the ones we're taught to ignore. Screens around the hall lit up. Images appeared. Shelters built over the years, kitchens staffed by former homeless youth, classrooms filled with kids who once lived on the streets, faces of people who had been